Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Lower Decks, which is episode 15 of Season 7 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Joe Y. So Lower Decks is the episode that follows a group of junior officers on the Enterprise, including the recurring supporting character Nurse Ogawa, a medical officer, Vinson Caesar, a security officer who appeared as a cadet in the 5th season episode The First Duty, and the characters of Ensign Sam Levin, a helmsman, Ensign Torek, a engineering officer, and Ben, a 10 forward waiter. Tensions start to rise between the group when Ben overhears Troy and Riker talking about how Sam and Sito are up for the same promotion. Sam tries a bit too hard to impress Riker, who holds this against him. Torek proves to be a bit too enthusiastic for LaForge, while Ogawa has a good relationship with Dr. Crusher, but she asks her about her boyfriend, and Crusher starts to suspect he's cheating on her and doesn't know how best to approach it. And Worf is impressed with Sito as he recommends her for the promotion, but things go hairy when Sito gets a dressing down from Captain Picard, who berates her for her involvement in the daredevil stunt at Starfleet Academy that resulted in the death of a cadet, as depicted in the episode The First Duty. Meanwhile, we see events play out from the junior officer's perspective as they recover an escape pod from the edge of Cardassian space and beam a survivor to sickbay, and the junior officers speculate on what is going on. Meanwhile, Worf runs a little test with Sito in his fighting class to get her to realize that she needs to stand up for herself, so she goes to Picard and does just that. Picard then reveals that his berating her was also a test, but not for the promotion, before a very dangerous mission, and she did indeed pass. So she learns the survivor in the escape pod was a Cardassian defector, and she's being asked to go on a mission posing as a Bajoran terrorist prisoner so the defector can return to Cardassian space to continue to spy on them for the Federation. So she does go on the mission, and she and the Cardassian learn to appreciate each other as they're normally natural enemies, but are both willing to risk their lives for each other. Later, the Enterprise discovers that the defector did indeed make it back to Cardassian space. However, the Cardassians detected Sito's escape pod as she tried to return to the Federation and destroyed it. In 10 forward, her friends mourn her passing, and so does Worf. However, Ben insists that he not do so alone, so he joins Sam, Torek, and Ogawa to commemorate the memory of Ensign Sito. So this is a great episode, and a really underrated episode. In particular, it's mostly underrated by this asshole here. Yes, that's right. I often underrate it, as I haven't mentioned it yet in any of my numerous top 10 episode lists, except it only received an honorable mention in my top 10 Cardassian episode video. Although in that video I was judging primarily the Cardassian storyline, which in this episode wasn't that important, but as an overall episode, I think this episode is amazing. So first off, the idea behind this episode to suddenly switch focus to the junior officers and see the events play through their eyes was an amazing one. It's actually an idea I had always wanted to see, as I often wondered about the junior officers and wanted to see what it would be like to focus more on them, and I feel this worked out better than I expected. Part of the reason it worked is that they incorporated a couple of characters we were already familiar with Nurse Ogawa, who had been a supporting character on the show for several years, but she barely had any lines, so it was great to finally get to know her. And indeed, after this episode, she was featured a tad bit more, such as in the episode Genesis, when Dr. Crusher was injured, Ogawa took over in sickbay, which actually doesn't make sense if you think about it, as she's just a nurse and there are actually other doctors on the ship. But the point is, she's a character we're already familiar with. And we also later learn she gets pregnant, and the loss of her pregnancy in an alternate timeline in All Good Things serves as an interesting plot point as well. And in addition to Ogawa, we see Sito Jaxa again, who appeared only in one episode, and even then just as a background character who was just going along with Cadet Locarno and covering out the daredevil stunt they tried to pull, but Wesley ended up ratting them out anyway. So it's great to see what became of her and to get to know her better. We also learned that Picard specifically requested her for the Enterprise to make sure she got a fair shot, which speaks a lot to Picard's character as well. And it was a good choice to essentially make her the focus of the episode, and I thought the actress did a damn good job of stepping up from a one-note character to the main focus of the episode. You really grew to identify with and root for her in this episode, and that was no small accomplishment. And they introduced two new characters as well, one of them being Ensign Sam Lavelle. I'm not sure how much I like this character, as he does oftentimes come off as an annoying douche, but you can still relate to him, as he's only trying to please his superior officers and sometimes comes off as trying too hard. Plus, I like the parallels they draw between him and Commander Riker. It was particularly interesting when they juxtaposed the two poker games at the same time with the junior officers and the senior officers, and the way this was edited together was perfect, as it really showcased the similarities between Lavelle and Riker. And the other new character was Ensign Torek, and I really liked this character. It was great to get a look at a younger Vulcan, one who was still learning, and who's, and I thought his interactions with his human friends was really interesting. And I dare say that I actually liked this character a tad bit more than other main Vulcan characters that were introduced later on, like Tuvok and T'Pol. But Torek does have the disadvantage of only appearing in this one episode. However, they did bring the actor back for Voyager to play another Vulcan engineer, Ensign Vorik, but then this begs the question on why create a new character at all? Why not just reintroduce Ensign Torek and say he was just transferred to Voyager? I mean, the two characters were pretty much identical anyway, and played by the same actor. It would have strengthened a sense of continuity, so I had absolutely no clue why they chose to do it this way. And then there was the waiter character of Ben, who doesn't appear that much in this episode, but I thought his inclusion was a nice added touch, as it was great to see the perspective of those not listed in Starfleet that serve on the ship, and that kind of light-hearted demeanor that he had, and how he felt more free to interact with junior and senior officers alike because he had no skin in the game. And seeing things from the perspective of the junior officers was a welcome change, as from time to time we get scenes where our main characters refer to some junior officers with some familiarity and talk about them in personal terms, but they're always just some unseen names who never actually appear in the show and are just mentioned. So it was interesting to get the same scene with Dr. Crusher talking about Alyssa Ogawa's relationship with her boyfriend and seeking Troy's advice, but to actually know who she was talking about and know a bit more about the character's backstory. And this also is true for Worf and Riker's discussion on who should get the ops position. Also, this episode really expands upon Worf's character as well, as it adds a nice dynamic to his character that he has this mentor-type relationship with one of his security officers, and to see him go to bat for her with Riker and then, do his special lesson to teach her to stick up for herself was a nice dynamic. And of course, this paid off nicely when Sito went on her mission, and it was touching to see Worf send her off and how he just stood there in the shuttle bay looking out into space after she left. It was really touching. And of course, what made this episode really great was the ending, which I have to admit brought me to tears several times, as it was really powerful and effective, because this episode does such a great job of getting you to know and care about Sito. Her death is that much more devastating, plus you can feel for her friends and Picard and Worf, and it was just really great. And Picard in particular, he saw potential in her, so it was a bit crushing. So when Picard makes that ship-wide announcement of her death, it is a real tearjerker moment. And that's a real credit to this episode in making Sito so endearing in this short amount of time. And of course, the final scene where Worf sits with her friends and they all nod in understanding, which shows a bridging between the senior and junior officers, was so touching and the perfect way to end the episode. It was also a nice scene where we see Ensign Caesar talking with the Cardassian defector and how they learn to appreciate each other for breaking with the stereotypes associated with their races and instead learn to set past feuds aside to learn to work together for the same goal. That was quite powerful as well. And apparently the character of Vinson Caesar was so well received in this episode after it was completed. Producer Michael Piller, who at first was insistent she stayed dead, said that they had to bring her back. There were plans to bring her back in a Deep Space Nine episode that would reveal she wasn't killed but spent the time in a Cardassian prison camp, and the episode would deal with her integration back into society as she deals with PTSD from the time she spent in prison. But that episode never came to pass, and instead parts of that story formed the basis of the fourth season Deep Space Nine episode Hard Time. I talked about this in my review for that episode, but I thought the idea with Cedo sounded like a much, much better episode than what they actually did do with Hard Time, and I would love to have seen her again. But on the other hand, it would have taken something away from this episode to reveal that she's not really dead, because part of what makes this episode so powerful is the sadness of the wasted potential that she had a promising career and her whole life ahead of her. And this does put a twist on the whole red shirt cliche in Star Trek, when junior officers are often killed off willy-nilly without anyone actually, caring and without much regard for their passing. Although, to be fair, that's more of a problem with the original series, as there are more examples in the Next Generation crew being affected by the death of minor characters, from the bonding to Q-Who. It's also interesting to note that the showrunners of the TV show Lost cited this episode as a huge inspiration for their third season episode Exposé, that focused on some of the minor and background characters who survived the plane crash but were never actually seen much in the show. Exposé was a very polarizing episode in Lost, as many fans hated it, but some fans loved it. I personally thought it was a good episode, but not a great one. But I think it's fair to say that Exposé didn't pull off this premise quite as well as Lower Decks did, which also just makes me appreciate this episode more. So now's the time for my minor nitpicks of this episode, and my biggest one being that this episode is a shining example of how more militarized the show became after Roddenberry's passing, as Gene Roddenberry was always very opposed to any comparisons between Starfleet and modern-day military, and I noted that the last two seasons of The Next Generation after Roddenberry's passing seemed to have a much more militarized feel to it, such as the separation between junior and senior officers depicted in this episode, and how the junior officers were mostly unaware of what was going on. Although that makes perfect sense in modern terms and ways of thinking, I feel it goes against Roddenberry's vision for The Next Generation as it was established, especially in its first two seasons. In particular was the revelation that the junior officers had to share quarters. This made sense in Star Trek Enterprise, where it was the first ship ever built for deep space travel, so it made sense that room would be limited, and this even made sense for the Defiant on Deep Space Nine, as that was a short-range warship not made for deep space travel or luxury. But it makes absolutely no sense here, as the Enterprise has been established as a luxurious, gigantic ship that was built with the comfort of the crew in mind, in order to create a sort of community in space. And when guests come aboard the ship, they often note how luxurious their quarters are, so it seems like bullshit to me that guests get these huge, luxurious quarters, but they force the junior officers to share rooms. Not to mention, everything we've seen on the show previously would indicate that everyone, including the junior officers, have their own quarters, but whatever. And it didn't really make sense for the junior officers to behave the way they did in this episode, and always trying to drill more information out of people and being so uncomfortable with being in the dark, because if indeed they are in dark about the larger picture of what's going on, and that's common practice on the Enterprise, the junior officers should be well used to it by now and know how to conduct themselves as Starfleet officers, but whatever. So my rating for Lower Decks out of 10 is a 10, the best. This was a bold episode that took a simple premise and made it amazing by having interested, well-rounded characters, which is what really carried this episode and made you care about this very powerful ending. So that's it for my review of Lower Decks. Please keep an eye out for my channel as I continue to do more Star Trek videos. However, I am not taking any more Star Trek episode requests at this time, and I may resume doing so in April or May of next year. However, I still have several episode requests pending, which I will get to before the end of the year. I'll also do many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Humans, Vikings, The Walking Dead, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.